temple and the corruption that Israel had introduced into that place, He's destroying it. And He's bringing in that which was strictly excluded and kept out of the Solomonic temple. This place will no longer contain the purpose of God. Again, in the line of thought that God, through Christ, was doing away with and destroying and replacing Solomon's temple, in this same passage in Matthew 21, after these events that I just described to you in the temple, Christ goes and spends the night in Bethany, and the next day He's on His way back to the temple, and they see the fig tree that doesn't have any fruit on it. Now remember your context. Remember your context. We're in the temple. Christ is being confronted by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. He's being confronted and questioned by them. He goes through this process of driving out the money changers. He brings the lame and the crippled that should have been excluded, and He heals them right there in the temple. And He's on His way back to the temple the next morning. And look at what He says. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, He went into it and found nothing on it, only leaves. A fig tree not bearing figs. And He said, may no fruit ever come from you again. Do you get the weight now in this context of what Christ is saying? Here you have the corporate Israel as a fig tree not bearing figs. You have corporate Israel not extending the glory and the worship of God to the nations and bearing fruit to the glory of God. Christ looks and He says, may no fruit ever come from you again. Now, keeping in mind that the temple and the nation of Israel were inextricably linked together. One was synonymous with the other. What is He doing? It's over with. I'm replacing all of this. I'm going to make everything new. Of course, He goes on and He curses that tree, and it's withered at once. And His disciples look at that and they marvel, and Jesus says to them, don't miss what He's saying here. Jesus says to them, don't marvel at this. I'm saying to you that if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain. Where was He at? He was standing in front of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. He said, you will say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. I believe Christ is closing the book on the Solomonic temple once and for all in this passage. That's certainly a teaching about faith and about prayer, but don't lose sight of the context in which Christ teaches that lesson. Then He goes on. He goes on in Matthew 21 and He tells the parable of the vineyard, that a master of a house planted a vineyard and he put a fence around it, and he dug a wine press and he built a tower and he leased it to tenants. Isaiah chapter 5 verses 1 through 6 likens Israel to a vine, and in her midst a wine press and a tower over which that is guarded, and all of that is in the temple setting there in Jerusalem. And Christ brings this parable before them where He compares Israel, where he talks about this master who planted this vineyard, rented it out. Do you remember the storyline in this parable? What happened when the master sent his servants to collect his rent? They were beaten and killed. So He said, maybe they will hear my son. And He sent His son, and they beat and killed His son. And then Christ looks at the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Jews there in the temple, and he says to them, what do you think this master should do? Who is he talking about? He's talking about fruitless Israel, who has not fulfilled the commission that God has given them to carry His glory and His worship to the nations. And He's there before them to call their attention to that and to extract from them what rightfully belonged to God. And what were they about to do? Killing. Then He says, what do you think the master of the vineyard should do to these? And what was their response? They condemned themselves. He said they said He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruit in their seasons. Now, what was the vineyard typical of here? Israel. What was the tower and the winepress typical of? The temple. What is Christ saying here? He's saying it is over with. I'm taking away what was yours and I'm giving it to others, and they will bear fruit. That's devastating. But He's closing the book on the temple. He's closing the book on it. At least the Solomonic temple. And then the next verse, He says, you see, we read these things and we don't remember the context. We don't string them together to see what He's actually saying. But look at what He says in the very next verse. He said, have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? What is the stone He's referring to? Himself. What is it the cornerstone of? The new temple. And who rejects the cornerstone? Israel. He said the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is what the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. That is a direct quote. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, as a direct quote from Psalm 118, verse 22. And the context in that psalm is the temple. You're rejecting the cornerstone, who is becoming the new temple. Therefore, you forfeit the temple. Go back and string all of that together and just spend some time going through that. But the idea that Christ Himself is the temple and the church is the temple being built upon Him as the cornerstone is clear throughout the New Testament. Ephesians 2:20, the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ Himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure being joined together grows into a holy temple unto the Lord. What is Christ telling them here? I'm replacing this physical temple that was never intended to be anything other than a figure and a type in the first place. I'm replacing it with the true temple, which is my people, built upon me, the chief cornerstone. He goes on in verse 43. The devastation continues. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. Israel's temple is being taken away and replaced with the true temple of the church. And then he says in verse 44, therefore I tell you, he says, and the one who falls on this